I want to welcome everybody to today's, let me get this recording, to today's meeting. You know, as we go into day 33 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think it's important. It's been a while since we all discussed the situation and to get reports from the ground and, you know, look for recommendations in way that we, and especially of all of you as former leaders and influencers, you know, to look for ways that we can try to stop the conflict. And, you know, I think everyone knows what's been happening, but, you know, last week, NATO held an emergency summit on the 24th of March. President Zelensky addressed the summit. And, you know, he has said that this is the time that we need to have talks. We need to have peace talks. We see, at least media reports are that today Turkey is going to host talks between the two sides. And at least I've read media reports that President Erdogan, you know, a member of NATO, has spoken with President Putin. So what we'd like to do today is hear from all of you, especially Katerina. We're very glad to see you and to hear your thoughts from what is happening on the ground. And then also to hear a report of what the Nizhava Ganjavi International Center's delegation has found. They visited Bucharest, Chisinau, and Warsaw in the past few days. And so I think what we'll do, if all right with you, Madam President Vaira, maybe we'll start with you to give a few remarks, and then we can hear from Katerina and go from there. And one person I think who hasn't participated before that I want to introduce all of you to is Ambassador John Teft. John has agreed to participate in today's discussion, and as a former ambassador to Ukraine, ambassador to Russia, ambassador to Lithuania, and ambassador to Georgia, I think he knows the region quite well. And John, we thank you for taking the time to participate in today's discussion. So with that, Vaira, I'll turn over the discussion to you, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to engage on this very important topic.
Thank you very much, Susan. We have been meeting off and on to discuss the situation and to see what we can do about it. There are various aspects to it, and I think what Eka started reporting on, and on which we will hear further on in this meeting, is very important. In other words, what is actually happening on the ground. And sadly, the news on the ground day to day are really getting worse. I mean, more of cities is being destroyed, more people are being killed, and the determination to continue with his plans on the part of President Putin is also being reaffirmed. What seeming shift in an emphasis, which we have seen in recent days, is the announcement coming from Moscow that the first part of the plan, having been successfully completed in the special operation in Ukraine, attention will now be concentrated on the Donbass. Now, of course, this, as all these official declarations from Moscow, is both illogical and meaningless in essence, but one has to try and read between the lines and to see what might be possibly at the back of it. When Putin says that everything goes according to plan, he's following a decades-old Soviet style of speech, where you had a plan, and then the plan had to be filled or overfulfilled, and ever since Stalinist times, everything has gone according to plan. So he had a plan, and every day of his invasion, no matter what happened on the ground, and absolutely, just like the Soviet plans were never in contact with reality, so it's no surprise that these military plans are what is being announced from Kremlin has very little real sort of basis in what is happening on the ground. Everything has been going successfully according to plan. And the point is that the plan is, on the one hand, he's thereby affirming that he had a plan to invade the whole of Ukraine, because after all, they're trying to encircle Kiev and still have thoughts of maybe possibly taking it over. But at the same time, we had, I forget the precise date, when Foreign Minister Lavrov came out and said, Russia is not invading any foreign country at all. Russia is certainly not invading Ukraine. Well, with declarations like that, it's like with Crimea. When they invaded and annected Crimea, Russia continued to insist that there were no Russian soldiers there, in spite of the passports that were taken from prisoners and that were brought to the Munich Security Council and paraded by the Ukrainian then president in front of everybody's eyes. But then after denying there were Russian soldiers in Crimea, they were given medals for their patriotic merits in gaining back Russia's territory that should and ought to belong to Russia from forever and ever. So these sort of contradictions, of course, continue. And to speak of negotiations in the ordinary sense of the word, that I think most people in the world would associate with it, in the case with Lavrov and Putin, it frankly doesn't apply. I think that the interpretation is that if they declare that they too are ready for talks, obviously Zelensky has to be ready for talks because his people are dying. But when they say they're ready for talks, it means they're regrouping their troops, because why? They still keep shelling Mariupol and other places. They still keep attacking and shooting at people retreating and trying to use humane corridors as refugees. So what they declare is again, without meaning. They're words, but there's no meaning and there's no corresponding action behind it. The supposed concentration on the Donbass, which supposedly was the original reason for liberating them and for invading Ukraine, in fact, is not happening on the ground. The shelling continues where it can, and if there's been some retreat, it's not for lack of trying. It's simply because the Ukrainian troops have managed to regain some territory. For my part, I have been following if you like, the ether in terms of how what is happening is being interpreted in different countries in the West and by different political analysts. And I see appearing elements where the rhetoric, the propaganda rhetoric proposed by Putin and his cronies about the interpretation of the situation, about their view of what is happening, is slowly seeping into certain Western channels and is slowly taking over the minds of some supposedly serious. I just a few days ago heard somebody from an institution, political studies in Boston, or you'd think would be somebody with an at least a neutral point of view, carrying on at great length how Russia had been wronged by the NATO breaking the solemn promises that had been made to Russia, that NATO would not enlarge to the east, not by a centimeter, when in point of fact, what he's talking about is Chancellor Kohls as German chancellors, discussions with President Gorbachev, the secretary of the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. Kohl is 6 feet under. Gorbachev is still alive, but his country, Soviet Union, does not exist anymore. And there never was a treaty about, or anything else that said that there will be no enlargement of NATO to the east, number one. Number two, there have been treaties such as the Budapest Memorandum, where the territorial integrity of Russia and America and the Brits were guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That written memorandum, official, has been broken. the United Nations Charter has been broken by Russia, but there's this great big fuss about supposedly some verbal promises made by Chancellor Kohl when he wished to have a reunified Germany, which required, of course, East Germany, a former member of the Warsaw Pact, to enter now NATO along with Western Germany. For that particular favor, he's saying that NATO would no longer, or maybe Secretary Baker possibly joining him. I've talked to Secretary Baker in the early 2000s, and frankly, he denies ever having made such a promise. So go figure. Eh? In other words, there is a propaganda going on. There's the hybrid war going on. And if we cannot do much about the war on the ground that requires armaments and support, there's, of course, there are other areas of activity, but this is for international and non-governmental charity institutions and social institutions about how to deal with the refugees. But I think what we as Nizami could very profitably and successfully work and contribute to is that information sphere where so much wrong argumentation and so much wrong interpretation of facts is happening as part of the hybrid war going on between Russia and the rest of the world. Sorry for being so long.
Well, thank you, President Vajra. I think that you really hit on some points about how the media and how the information campaigns have affected what people are thinking about in terms of what's going on. And I was pleased to see, and I did see some of it, that President Zelensky actually spoke with Russian journalists. I believe it was yesterday or earlier today, but in fact, that those journalists are not able to broadcast in Russia. So I think what we'll do next, because we do have limited time and we have lots of people to speak, and so if we can try to keep your remarks to around 2 to 3 minutes, that would be great. But I think the next thing that we're all very anxious to hear is from Katerina, who is in is experiencing and has family on the ground in Ukraine. And so Katerina, if maybe you could give us your impressions of, the real story, what's going on in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank President Vike Freiberger for bringing up a very important point. I'd also like to add that in 1997, there were many treaties signed between NATO, Russia, and Ukraine, also recognizing Ukraine. So there's a series of things that were signed as opposed to these ephemeral ideas of something that was said at some point over dinner. Yes, we're in day 33, and despite full-scale aggression, use of weapons of mass destruction, constant threats to our nuclear facilities, Ukraine is holding its own. And in fact, we are winning in some areas. On the other hand, we are hearing constant sirens throughout the country. Just less than 2 hours ago, Kiev heard sirens. There were other places, and it seems like throughout the country, somehow over 24 hours, they hear sirens and people are being forced to hide. It's psychological pressure as well as tremendous fear. Mariupol, the poor city of Mariupol, which has been attacked, it's besieged. There are about 160,000 people trapped in Mariupol without water and food, and the humanitarian corridors are not being allowed, and they're being shot at. 15,000 people from Mariupol have been now deported to Russia. And this is, following, decades-old policy of moving, it's an ethnic cleansing, moving people out there with the idea of then moving Russians in. They have been abducting mayors in these areas. Any mayor, any leader that does not agree to go with Russia is being abducted or killed. And Chernihiv, a city just north of Kiev, has been suffering tremendous bombing. And they're also continuing attacks on the northwest and east side of Kiev. But the Ukrainian forces have been able to move some of that back. But for example, I spoke with my next door neighbor at our house. Some of you have visited our home, and he said the fighting there was louder than he had ever heard up till then. Indeed, there is some sign that they may be moving a little bit away from us because they're losing here in Kiev. So they're moving toward Donbass, and the leadership of our armed forces believe that they may try to come up from the south and from the north and try to close off Donbass so that they could then create besiege our military there and wipe out the military that's currently in Donbass. And that's our fear. Yesterday, the economy ministry came up with an estimate of the destruction to date, and it's 560 billion so far, with 120 billion in state infrastructure, and that includes 90 billion in personal property and 80 billion in business property. I have to tell you, personally, I have thought that this will be over in a matter of weeks and months. So when President Biden, during his very, very moving speech the other day in Poland, said this will take years, I have to say, into a sense of depression. And I asked my husband, could that be that it won't be weeks or months, but that it could take years? And my husband answered that it will not be fast. We cannot end it quickly. And there's only two ways that this could end. Either we win, or it will end with ethnic cleansing and a genocide of our people. There's no other way. Anything in between is just hopeful, but it cannot end any other way because we have a very determined enemy with one goal, and that's to completely incorporate Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We can win. We strongly believe we can win, but to do so, we need to have our allies give us offensive weapons, not just defensive weapons. Right now, we're being given just enough to protect ourselves, but not enough to actually gain back the territories that we have lost. We can do that. We have the determination and the capability to do that, but we need weapons, we need ammunition, we need a no-fly zone. And as our close friend of our group, Ambassador Frank O'Donnell, has pointed out, it does not have to be NATO. We could get a no-fly zone through the United Nations, through an allied coalition, including of neutral countries. My final point is I want to say that this is not just about Putin. If Putin were to go, there's still Russia that has pursued the same policy, not only for decades, but for centuries, of trying to incorporate not only Ukraine, but other neighbors. This war against Europe has gone on. And so we do not see even that it's just Putin's war, it is Russia's war against us. And therefore, what we really, really want is to see strategy and leadership from Europe, from the UK, from the United States, not just hope and kind words, but we really need something that is much more of a strong strategy to deal with this threat not only to my country, but to Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katerina, and thank you for giving us the what you see on the ground. And I thought maybe before I call on another speaker, does anyone have any questions for Katerina? Because I think you've brought up some very good points. Kind words are nice. Even the actions that have been taken, I think have had some effect, but they haven't really stopped the aggressive behavior. And so I think one of the things that we want to talk about is is there a diplomatic solution? And I would agree that even if the fighting doesn't go on for a long time, the destruction that's come to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian people, is something that is not going to be fixed in a short period of time. So does anyone have any questions or comments? I think, Sipi, why don't you go ahead? Just need to unmute yourself.
And I'm saying that we are all thinking of you, Katerina, and supporting, but as you said, it's not enough. And I'm also the global community is speaking in staying with the Ukraine and everything, but I agree that it's not going to solve the problem. And in a way, you are being supported, but yet you are those that are fighting. The question is there, assuming that on the other side, there is somebody that is willing or the end game is something that would be accepted by him, and I'm not sure. Do you see any diplomatic outcome end game that is not just winning or hopefully not losing in this war? What can be an end game?
See, but I would love to say there is, and part of me wishes there could be, but I do not believe there is, because I think that anything that is short of us winning will just be a respite for them to regroup and attack again.
Okay.
And we have seen this over and over. And I think that if we give them a year or two, we will just see them come back, maybe come back a little bit smarter and stronger.
Okay, so basically there is, okay, so you cannot see any hope in the negotiations, basically.
First of all, they don't want to negotiate. They just put forward ultimatums to us. Second of all, we have learned that no matter what they promise, they never keep their promises. So what is the point of negotiating with someone who has never kept a promise and who has declared that you should not exist? I hate to say this, but they've even used the word many times, of the words final solution. I think you understand that that's something we can't accept.
No, I completely understand. I'm trying, I'm trying to think whether there is.
See, something I have often said is in 1944, 1943, did anyone come and say, what is a face-saving measure for Hitler right now? What is an off-ramp for Hitler now? What land should we allow him to keep? What land should we demand that he give back? We would not have said that because it was unacceptable. It was unfathomable. And frankly, as Ukrainians, we feel the same now. You cannot negotiate with war criminals.
Okay.
But Ismail, you had your hand up for a question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I have a question. Just so I know, you're saying that they're now moving people out of the southeastern part of Ukraine into Russia, and that's part of the ethnic cleansing and preparation for whatever. But there's also, I suppose, the possibility that that's a preparation for some sort of a referendum, or because they may be saying, okay, we will ask the people there if they want to stay with Ukraine or they want to join Russia, having changed the composition of the people, then they would get a sort of self-supporting view that these people would like to join rather than stay in Ukraine. Now that may be a face-saving device. I'm just wondering whether you could give us, Catherine, if you could give us some feel for the Donbas region and the people there. Do they feel very strongly associated with the Ukrainian effort, or are they in fact playing the Russian game?
I would say that even if there were in the eastern parts of our country even if there were at some point up to 20% of the people who might have been pro-Russian, that has absolutely disappeared now. The people are, after the bombings, after the killings, all the support they have gotten has gone. Our president has said that maybe on issues such as NATO, we would be willing to put it to a referendum of our people, but we will not have a referendum at gunpoint as it was in Crimea, or that they tried to do an LNR, DNR. So the only referendums we would ever hold is if every last soldier, foreign soldier left our country. Then we might consider some types of referendums, for example, on the issue of NATO. But I have to tell you that the issue of NATO neutrality, the feeling toward it has changed a great deal over the last 33 days, and where we might have had 52 or 56% support before, it's now in the 70s percent, 80%, 90% even in most areas. And so I don't think that they ever expected a real referendum. If they ever have a referendum, it would be similar to the one they had in Crimea, which was at gunpoint and completely falsified, and keeping anyone who really felt strongly, such as the Crimean Tatars, from voting.
But I think Petra has a question, and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Petra or Petar?
Petra and then Petar. Sorry for confusion.
I'm
You
sorry.
both have your hand up, but
No
confusion.
confusion.
Yeah, Petra was first.
No confusion. Well, from what Katerina just said, Viktor Yushchenko doesn't have any hope that Russia would open at any time a negotiation. It's what I understood. I think it's very clear. And I understand that because I don't know why we do not say more, that just to compare what Russia said before the invasion. We do not have a plan to invade Ukraine. They said that so many times. And then suddenly, abruptly, they started the invasion. What do you need more to understand what's in their mind? It's absolutely obvious. So, but what I think Vaira said, and it's exactly my feeling, reading the most important Western papers, is that somehow the propaganda, the Russian propaganda about what's going on in Ukraine is creeping somewhere. I've seen analysis in the best Western media, which seem to say, okay, by now we should refrain from that, and that, because maybe we can end the war, and we don't see any possibility ending the war. So maybe there is more than military weapons that could be used in favor of Ukraine, which is to use our capacity to communicate, to convince more and more people that it's a total lie. What's going on from the Russian propaganda, it's a total lie. There is no such thing as explanation or motivation or argument in favor of what's going on in Ukraine right now. Why it is so difficult to help Ukraine from this point of view? Just to say the truth, nothing more. I think that we are here a little bit not at the level of the real necessity in terms of convincing the whole world that what's going on there is just a war, and there is no argument. I remember in 1999, when Romania, and I was then leading Romania, we joined the NATO operation against Slobodan Milosevic. You know that at that moment, Russia was ferociously against us. Why? Because we are NATO, we are trespassing the international legality. They said that then. What they are doing now? I mean, these are facts of history. So I think we can also do something more important, more powerful in terms of convincing people what's going on there in reality. And let's have in mind something. President Putin does have a number of ropes in his hands. I don't know how many and how strong, but one of the ropes is that. It's to say again and again that they are what? They are there to get rid of Ukraine of Nazis, that it's entirely normal that they invaded Ukraine, that they are there in pursuing a war for freedom and things like that. And in the meantime, thousands, maybe later on, we have to speak about our mission in Moldova. It was an extraordinarily important experience to understand really the destiny of refugees. From intellectually and even from the human point of view, we can imagine. No, when you see them as we saw them, it's very, very different. Well, thank you.
Well, I think, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your comment. And I think what I'd like to do, I know, Petar, you also have a comment. Everyone will get an opportunity to speak. I had asked maybe for, but not comments, but specifically to ask Katerina, questions. But what I'd like to do is move on with the discussion. We will have an opportunity for Eka and others to bring forward what you found, because we do want to talk about what is the effect of not only the horrible effects of what's happening in Ukraine, but what are the ripple effects on the region. But I think what I'd like to do is move to Ambassador Teft now. And, one of the things that I asked him to talk about, given his large experience in the region and his understanding of not only Ukraine, but of Russia, is, what are things that we can do, Europe and the United States? Is there a way that we can assist, other than having an all-out military conflict, to try to bring this conflict to an end? So, John, I'll turn the floor over to you, and if you can, keep your remarks brief. As you can see, this is a very difficult topic, and we all have a lot to say. So, over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Susan, and let me just say thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be able to join such a distinguished group of world leaders, and I would also say some old friends who I see on the screen. It struck me this morning when I got up and looked at the newspaper that here we are on a day that we all used to only dream of. The U.S. Secretary of State is in Israel, meeting with the foreign ministers of Israel and other Arab countries, a day most of us never thought we'd see in our lifetime. And yet here we are today talking about a war which none of us ever really wanted to dream about, but which, a lot of my friends, both Ukrainians and Russians, have said to me recently, we never had this struggle with Russia when the Soviet Union ended in 1991. And as one commentator said last week, this is Ukraine's real war of independence. Katya made many of the points that I had hoped to make, so I will not try to repeat those, other than to say that my view is that we are that the cause of this conflict is really one man, and I understand the views within the Russian elites and among the political establishment. But we wouldn't be where we are today if we didn't have this delusional, what I would think is a delusional dream of Vladimir Putin of trying to reconstitute the Russian Empire. We've all talked about and all read about the many miscalculations, long-term, short-term, political, intelligence, military. But I think the fundamental miscalculation here is at a deeper seam, and that is that Putin has never really understood or wanted to understand the desire of the Ukrainian people to live in a truly independent European state. He has this single-minded, ideological, it's almost messianic view of Russian history, which he's adopted over the last few years in particular, in which Ukraine is a part of Russia. He wants to be what the Russians call a gatherer of lands, and I know many of you know about this. And he's single-minded in his attempt to try to do this. In doing that, he's never understood the power of modern Ukrainian civic nationalism, which is what I would call it. When I finished my assignment as ambassador to Ukraine in 2013, I retired and then was called back to be ambassador in Russia. And right before I left Ukraine, I had made trips to Donetsk, Lugansk, down to, and then made a trip to Odessa and across to Mykolaiv and Kherson. The following year, when I arrived in Moscow, I heard all of this stuff about land bridges and the rest. And I said, you know, these people, you know, that my staff and I met when we were there, they don't talk about this stuff. They don't want to be a part of Russia. And there was this huge gulf between the perception in Moscow and the reality on the ground inside of Ukraine. Yesterday, I was watching on the TV Mike Morrell, who used to be the deputy director of the CIA. And he said that his analysis is that we're now entering a second phase of the war. Not that Russia would give up the chance to try to take Kyiv, as was their primary goal, but he saw that the Russians are, in fact, are starting to dig in north of Kyiv. They're still going to indiscriminately fire rockets and artillery into these cities, causing the horrific numbers of casualties, as Katya has talked about. They want to try to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And I think we all know the models here. Chechnya, Aleppo, and Mariupol are the models. They're try to do the same thing. These are war crimes, but human suffering, as we've seen over his career, doesn't seem to faze Vladimir Putin. Let me just say the other part of this is about Russia itself. And, you know, I think all of us hope that the sanctions will have some impact. And in saying that, I also acknowledge that Vladimir Putin, those of you who've read his biography know he was a street fighter in Leningrad back when he was growing up. And he's always been like that. He never likes to compromise, or at least only till the very end, and then to couch it in some form of, quote, victory or unquote. But the vice is squeezing inside of Moscow itself. Just this morning, I read that Novaya Gazeta, the editor who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, Mr. Muratov, has said they're not going to publish anymore for the rest of the war because they're under great pressure. Thousands, as we know, have left Russia. Many journalists have left. Free expression has basically. No. But other thousands of Russians, many of the middle class that had developed over the last 2 decades, many of them also started to leave, both because of fear, but also because they don't want to live in the Russia that Vladimir Putin has created. All of this is to say, I don't see any short-term political solution, Susan. I'm sorry to have to say that. I wish it was otherwise. I think the war is going to have to continue. And this is terrible because, as Katya said, many more innocent people will die. I can talk some more later if people would like about the Biden administration policy. I would just make one comment to some of the statements that were made in the questions, and that is that I don't see American resolve, the resolve among the people in our country, and I think certainly among the major media outlets, I don't see the resolve changing. And whatever you think about the Biden administration approach, particularly on controversial issues like the no-fly zone or other things, I think it's important to remember that Biden and his team are carefully calculating, and there are many politicians on this in this conversation, they carefully calculate, I think every day, how they can keep the American people and the American political establishment, the bipartisan consensus in Congress supporting Ukraine, but also how you keep the alliance together. And there's a lot of other issues, many experts on this group that could talk about that. But I think this is a fundamental understanding. It may not be what people want to hear, but he's trying to make sure that he keeps everybody moving forward. And I think his trip to Europe this last week was about trying to do that, to try to keep everybody on the same sheet, to be prepared for what looks to be a longer term battle, which is unfortunate, but it's, I was intrigued to hear Katya say that that's what her husband, President Yushchenko, is also anticipating at this point. At that point, I'll stop. I'd be happy to talk about any other issues, but that's kind of my take, Susan. Thanks.
Well, and thank you, John, for that very frank and informed thinking. And I think you're right. And I would just like to tell our European friends, at least from as an American, I think that there is united support for Ukraine and Ukrainian people, but that President Biden is walking a delicate balance of how can he best help the Ukrainian people, but also keep the European alliance together, and to make sure that we do everything that we can to help without escalating the military conflict even further. And Ravshan, I think maybe we should go now to the two recorded messages we had, maybe first from Dr. Petros and then from Prime Minister Brown. Are you ready? You can set those up for us?
Sure. 1 second.
Of Ukraine's population have now been forcibly. It's now 1 month since the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine began. Almost 10 million people, nearly a quarter of Ukraine's population, have now been forcibly displaced. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate in many parts of the country and is critical in the Mariupol and Bucha districts. The disruption to services and supplies throughout Ukraine is posing an extreme risk to people with cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, HIV, and TB, which are among the country's leading causes of mortality. Displacement, poor shelter, and overcrowded living conditions caused by the conflict are also increasing the risk of diseases such as measles, pneumonia, and polio, as well as COVID-19. So far, WHO has delivered about 150 metric tons of medical supplies. We have established supply lines from our warehouse in Lviv to many cities in Ukraine. But access to many parts of the country remains blocked. A humanitarian convoy to Mariupol was not able to be dispatched due to insecurity. Attacks on health must stop. Health systems, facilities, and health workers are not and should never be a target. We also have concerns around the integrity and safe operation of nuclear and chemical facilities. WHO is working with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and we continue to call on all sides to minimize the risk of a nuclear or chemical accident, which could have catastrophic consequences for human health. We continue to call on the Russian Federation to stop the war.
Today, as we mourn the dead of Ukraine, we salute the living.
1 second.
We stand in awe of the resilience of the Ukrainian people.
Just a second. Okay. Yeah.
Today, as we mourn the dead of Ukraine, we salute the living. We stand in awe of the resilience of the Ukrainian people. The elderly Ukrainian man who stood unbowed in front of Russian tanks. The brave soldiers who refused to entertain even for a minute Russian ultimatums. The president who every day stirs his nation by refusing to surrender to intimidation and blackmail. A people whose courage, even when buildings and lives are being destroyed, is indestructible, and whose spirit, even as hearts are being broken, seems unbreakable. And that is why all of us in every part of the world, when this great nation's very existence is in jeopardy, consider ourselves to be citizens of Ukraine. For the cost of war is not to be counted only in tanks destroyed, missiles used, and bullets fired, but in maimed children, thousands of dead, and the suffering of the innocent. So as civilians are bombed indiscriminately, a crime in international law, as hospitals, schools, and public buildings are targeted, also a crime in international law, as humanitarian corridors and ceasefires are breached, a crime in international law, and chemical and even nuclear weapons are threatened, a crime also in international law. We ask the civilized world to consider doing again what the world decided to do in 1942, when so outraged by the evil of Nazi war atrocities, we resolved to bring to justice the perpetrators of evil. And that momentous decision to punish what we called a crime against peace led to the Nuremberg trials. And just as 3 decades ago, we also brought war criminals to court, charged with crimes against humanity in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, and in Liberia. So today we must support the creation of a war crimes tribunal, charged with prosecuting the crime of aggression, supplementing therefore the sanctions, the travel bans, the humanitarian military help now being given Ukraine, and complementing the work of the International Criminal Court, which will investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity. There will be a time for a grand strategy that looks beyond the conflict. For even as Russia prosecutes war, we must strive for peace. And NGIC members have a special role to play. Even when there is so much division, we must work for dialogue. Even when people are violently pushed apart, we must attempt to bring them together. We must never act from fear, but never fear to act. And even when old bridges are being blown up, all of NGIC must try to build bridges anew. And I repeat the belief that inspires and animates this great international center, that there is a shared European destiny, an indissoluble European project, and a common European home that should be open to all of us, from far west to far east. And for all these reasons, I ask you to join the 1.5 million who have signed the petition on the Avaz website calling for a war crimes tribunal, and to demand every European government now supports the creation of such a tribunal to bring Putin to justice and hold evil to proper account.
Well, I want to thank, I think especially Prime Minister Gordon Brown has given us some food for thought about the war crimes that are being, committed. But I think what I'd like to do now, I think Dr. Tetros has brought up a subject that we did want to cover today, is about the effect, the humanitarian effect that this is having on the region, and not on the people who have had to move and leave Ukraine to go to Poland and other countries. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Nizavi Ganjavi International Center led a fact-finding mission. In fact, I still think that Eka and Rafshan are on the mission to see what is happening with the displaced persons, and perhaps what we can do again to ensure that that the humanitarian efforts are not thwarted. So Eka, why don't I give the floor to you so you can tell us a little bit about what you've been seeing.
Sure, thank you, Susan. I'll try to be concise in my comments and feedback, since we have with us today colleagues that have been with us at the mission as well. But I have to say that emotionally, it was a very, very hard mission to undertake. We've had a chance of meeting refugees in Romania, in Moldova, in Poland, to engage with people who are in such a distress, to be not only in the situation of the distress through which they had to go through, but then facing so much unknowns in their life right now when it comes to what is it that the future holds for them in the current situation. What we did with the mission was that to try to see and feel on the ground the situation in at least 3 countries where refugees are directed now because of Russian invasion. Romania, Moldova, and Poland. These are not the only destinations where immediately the crossover of the borderline takes place from Ukraine, but they are some of the major ones, at least transiting ones as well for some before they go to other destinations in Europe. Couple of observations perhaps to generalize the feedback. All of the refugees that we have spoken with have that very strong feeling that they are very temporarily in the locations where they are. They try to be even closer as much as possible to Ukraine. Hence, many try to stay in Moldova, even though, you know, it's not a very affluent country, as we all know, and I'll describe a bit more the challenges that they face in Moldova, to see that when opportunity arises, they could go back right away. And that feeling was very palpable. All of them have very strong perception that and determination, I would say, not a perception, that as soon as the situation will allow them to go back, they are determined to go back no matter what, no matter how uncertain perhaps the return for them to be in that time frame. I can say that while speaking with some of our counterparts in Poland, and then one of our friends there, he just visited immediate sort of borderline of Ukraine and Poland. He said that during that day when he went there, inbound to Ukraine movement in terms of numbers was even larger than outbound in that particular day, because even now, when there are sirens going all over in major cities in the west of Ukraine as well, Ukrainians are going back. And I think that is a very important factor for Europe to know, for all that are receiving refugees, that it's only that utmost distress that drives them back. And even in this situation, not only males who are coming back to fight, but then female Ukrainians as well, if they have a chance to leave their children with their relatives and friends in safe places, they still go back and try to do something on the ground in Ukraine itself. And I think that is very important to mention, because when we speak about the refugees and humanitarian aspect of what is happening, we think about those who are outside of Ukraine, which is very, very much needed. But then we have to pay attention to how much in quantities we have internally displaced person inside of Ukraine as well. Those who are in millions, who don't want to go outside of Ukraine and would rather stay in Ukraine and contribute to the resilience of their own country if they can, they need to be under the very strong focus of everybody who generates assistance now to Ukraine, because IDPs are extremely important. They find it very hard for them to resettle into locations where they are. They are still in the distress when it comes to security situation. All my team members in Ukraine, every day, at least 3 or 4 times, they have to go to shelters, even in the West Ukraine, basement shelters, or being enclosed buildings when the sirens go on. So, but they want to stay and they don't want to leave. And that's a very clear position that they have. So we've been trying to emphasize that with the donor community representatives as well that we've met, and then international organizations. We do it all the time at the meetings that we have, that please pay attention to what happens in Ukraine when it comes to the humanitarian needs that the people have there, when it comes not only to the security, which is key, but then to the basics for them to be able to maintain their livelihood in very distressful situation of reallocation and security environment they are in. Now, when it comes to the situation outside of Ukraine, it varies significantly, and it was very palpable when you try and move that, starting from Romania, then Moldova, and then Poland. Moldova is in the harder situation when it comes to how to cope with the immense burden that the spillover effect of the conflict, of the war has on Moldova, which is a very small country, economically in dire situation with ongoing energy crisis with Russia, and then the economic situation that for so long had been in a poor condition in Moldova. The new government is mobilized as much as they can. We've seen remarkable empathy and organization of civilians, ordinary community members, volunteers, local municipalities all across these 3 countries to help and to organize work for the help of refugees. But then you could have the common feeling in all of these 3 countries that they deal with the problems of today, because they, in some countries like Moldova, could be insurmountable very soon. But in none of those countries, as of yet, there is any contingency planning as to what needs to be done or can be done if the situation of hosting refugees in large numbers continues longer than just a few months. And then this is a reality that everybody has to dwell upon and then realize that. And then we have that experience in Georgia, unfortunately, of different waves of IDPs inside of the country. When the first months or two of that mobilization passes, when you are in the safety, so to say, then the different waves of emotional distress come to IDPs. And it's very important how to ensure that neither the recipient countries have a bit of a fatigue with the refugees, and then even more so, refugees feel continuously not only welcome, but realized, integrated, and having an opportunities to work, and then to feel that they are not refugees when it comes to the possibilities that they might have, but then they are being temporarily, but integrated in the social fabric in the way and economic, so that they could be contributing to their families and to the local communities as well. And I have to say that Ukrainian people are extremely creative, very entrepreneurial, hard workers. Everywhere where they go, if they are potential for them to do more and contribute to the local communities, they will be contributing so much more rather than taking as a benefit from the countries that they are hosted in right now. So that's I guess part of what NGIC could do now, apart from generating attention to the problems of today, which are so large and complex, but try to generate planning, ideas, creative strategies of consolidating common efforts and network alliance of organizations that could already start to work on the future now, hopefully not for a long-term future, but at least in transitioning time from today's emergency into the period when we have to see that refugees are really integrated in the way that, while having that clarity that it's a temporary integration, they have the possibility of dignified presence in the countries where they are. It's not only psychological help that is needed in these situations, but then it's engagement, it's possibility of realization, possibility of education for minors, which, for example, in the case of Moldova is 12% of the overall number of population of minors in Moldova. So you can imagine what is the degree and scale of burden on Moldova when it comes to what they need to do to make sure that the schooling system, the healthcare system has the capacity of integrating that number of the refugees and incomers. Poland the common, I guess, understanding that me and Rovjan at least had, because we were the ones who continued with Poland, was that the best level of organization, coordination of work and resources that are dedicated as a combined effort of public and private efforts for dealing with the situation of extremely large number of refugees was really remarkable. They have to deal on an everyday basis with a staggering number of the refugees that they have to process, they have to deal with, and the way they do, it's not only dignified, but it's remarkable when it comes to how they have managed to organize the business process. But Poles were very open that they don't have the capacity now to start to think of tomorrow. It's the emergency of today that they're dealing now. And they would very much appreciate to see how that common effort could be built in such a way so that we could do more for the immediate tomorrow already. And I'm not speaking about the long-term period of perspective that needs to be tackled. We have raised issue of human trafficking as a challenge in every 3 countries that we've been. And in every country, it has been confirmed that this is a challenge. They are trying to do the best they can to mitigate the risk, but they see that the risk will be increasing over the time, not only in their own countries, but in the countries where they go as the refugees, as a continuation of their very distressful journey, so to say, in other countries. And that is something where we could definitely contribute quite strongly as well, to be part of that discourse and then to contribute to how to deal with the situation of human trafficking, and then contribute to mitigation of the risks in this direction. And then at the end of the day, what I would want us all to maybe reminded about as well is that this domino effect that I've mentioned in the beginning when we had an informal conversation before all of us joined the meeting is very alarming to me as a representative of a country that is part of that puzzle in Georgia itself. We are partially occupied, as you all know, by Russian forces. Russian forces stand in right vicinity of my own capital, so to say, in my own country right now with the Russian troops being present on the ground. But what happens now in Nagorno-Karabakh is extremely alarming to the whole region. We see that Russia might be already provoking a potential of distraction in the way to draw Azerbaijan into the conflict, to draw potentially then Georgia into the flare up of the confrontation. And then beyond our region, Balkans strikes to me as well as a place of location in geographically in Europe as well, which could be a very convenient point for further escalation by Russia. Russia wants to overwhelm all of us so that it's more difficult for all of us to see what could be the solution in this very situation we have found ourselves. And then very final sort of appeal from my side could be that the way my experience tells from observing and being part of processes of victimization by Russia when it comes to my own country, diplomacy and negotiations are not very much valued by Russia when it comes to the real decisions that they have to make. The only chance for Ukraine to survive now and then to open up actually any chance for negotiations is to have a changed situation on the battlefield on the ground. And for that, Ukraine is not asking for the boots on the ground, they ask for the tools. And those tools are very specific now. This is mid-range and long-range military systems, predominantly even defensive rather than offensive, but offensive should be part of the parcel as well. As long as the situation allows for Russia to dig in, protract, punish and inflict atrocities on Ukraine, they will never negotiate. I don't know if you, in a meaningful sense, but not in the farce process. There is new information that came out recently today that Abramovich, the famous oligarch of Russia, had his own moves for mediation now. He met with Putin apparently, delivered handwritten letter from President Zelensky, identifying issues that could have been subject of negotiation and possible agreements. And Putin got very furious. And then he said that I will trash them. And then that's my only response. So all these mediations and then, fictitious attempts from Russia's side is just stalling the time until they could achieve militarily what they want to achieve in Ukraine. And as long as we're not helping Ukraine with arms, we are deluding ourselves that we're doing something when it comes to helping Ukraine, to be honest about it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sure that the colleagues will contribute with mission-related feedback.
Yeah, thank you, Eka. And I think the main point of your concern again is the idea that we've heard from Katerina and even from John about this is not going to be a short conflict, and then what happens to the people who aren't going to be able to go back in a short period of time, and what do they have to go back to but a lot of destruction. So I think Ravshan wants to make a few comments, and then after that we'll go to Prime Minister Gavrici, who is former Prime Minister of Moldova. So Ravshan, did you have something you wanted to say?
Actually, it just what we see and on the cameras and on TV is totally different than what you're witnessing when you are seeing and you are talking to these people. The biggest problem which we saw is, number one, is everyone is traumatized. They are not in condition now to even decide where they wanted to go. I saw like one family in Moldova. They are every day taking 1 hour walking distance in order per day to be able to take per dime like 10 euros or bread and food for eating. And the problem is generally, it's especially coming up from the little children. You can't imagine what's trauma people. If I can ask, someone is not muted and it's always creating a noise, just if interruptions not to be. The little kids, people were like, what they've been saying that is the biggest trauma for their life is they just wanted to run out, but from places they don't want to. Almost 90% of the population, the people whom we were able to meet, they had one talk. No one wants to go outside Europe. Everyone is willing to go back to their home countries. Even it's destroyed, they do understand this. But the condition in number of countries, mismanagement and management crisis is such a terrific the terrible situation. People are living in Moldova and in Romania in sad conditions that, some people were having even families over 6 days. They couldn't be able to take showers. They don't have a place how to wash the dress codes. And they've been, I saw like, little kid who was just screaming and crying because he couldn't be able to leave his father. And because he has a trauma that his father will leave and something tragic was going to happen. And another family was telling that even for holidays or for celebrations, there is some fires here. We immediately trying to run under the beds and under the tables just to, because we feel like, someone is going to bomb us again. But the issue is no one wants to go outside. Everyone wants to be back to Ukraine. But that was like, unique things that I could be able to see. And solidarity, people, how they've been supporting each other, it's extraordinary. But as Miseka said, beside Poland was extraordinarily well organized in all the meanings of refugee crisis. I think that, I will also ask everyone, to stick to the time limits in order we can just at least to share ideas, and then maybe someone may have questions and so on. Especially it will help us to build up our second trip, which we will do with Ambassador Susan Liot, and Jim Schneider will go there because she may share with her experience about the human trafficking, which is majority of the people are fearing to go to France and to Europe in order not to face up this human trafficking. Because we have to remember now that most of the people living from Ukraine, they don't have a biometric identity IDs. That's why they are like, the most easily victims for human trafficking and also a number of other things. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you. And why don't we go to Mr. Prime Minister Gabrici, who was also part of the fact-finding mission and can give us a perspective from what's happening in Moldova.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. Yes, Moldova is one of the neighboring countries of Ukraine. So we basically faced the first wave of Ukrainians trying to leave and leaving Ukraine. What we managed to focus from the first hours on the 24th of February, we focused on number of refugees, people in need, people needed to stay, sleep somewhere over the night, eat something, or understand where they can go from Moldova. So Moldova is basically a place for most of the Ukrainians to come to understand the situation and from here to go further. The big number of volunteers immediately reacted to this indeed under the guidance of Moldovan government. And we this way managed to serve to around 350,000 Ukrainians that passed through Moldova. Out of this, around 100,000 decided to stay and to remain in Moldova. The thing which I would like to mention, the ones that remained to stay in Moldova, these are the ones that they are really having a hope that soon this war will end and they will be able to turn back to their houses or places as soon as possible. One important thing about this 100,000 Ukrainians that remained in Moldova to be mentioned is that around 46,000 of them are underage kids, I would say. And our government is really involved and working on these refugees that decided to remain, decided to stay, looking for the solutions. Eka mentioned about the school, the education, and so on, but also something like medical care, social assistance, and so on. So because of these needs, we decided, and it was a sort of wise decision to open the refugee centers. Some of them with normal conditions, but some of them are still missing the normal conditions for humans. So the volunteers or the donors are joining, are helping, and are trying to make those places a proper place to sit, sleep, and live during this period of time. 110 centers of refugees are opened so far. What I am proud to say is that Moldovans show the solidarity to this situation, and a lot of people jumped, a lot of companies jumped and supported this situation. We hope that we will be able to handle this because Moldova is not a rich country. Moldova has a lot of not in the good shape, I would say, in terms of financials and economy, and that's why we are trying to handle it at this moment. But soon, I think we will need more help and more support as Moldova from outside partners or developing partners. We are witnesses of destroyed families, separated kids from their fathers, and Ravshan mentioning kids are suffering in the situation when they had to leave their fathers, or families had to leave their sons in Ukraine to defend, to fight, and to protect their country in order to be able to secure, or to not to secure, but to bring them back, to bring their families back at one moment. We really hope that this will end. We really hope that this will not cost the humanity that much. We already heard the figures in terms of business infrastructure costs of Ukraine so far. This cannot be counted when you talk about people, when you talk about families, when you talk about those kids that are suffering at this moment. I would like to thank everyone who got to be involved, who got to know the situation, and who is willing and daring to help into this situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Prime Minister. I think that you have really outlined one of the key issues is that many of the displaced people are young children who are alone because their parents have stayed, to defend their country. And I just thought maybe briefly would call on, I don't know if Jean Balderschneider, if you have any comments, because I know you've been involved in combating trafficking in persons, and anything that we can do as a group to ensure that that these vulnerable young people aren't preyed upon by traffickers.
Jean, if I may add, one short comment, I think that it's really most important comments that, and many apologizes. Ambassador Paul, Dr. Paul Riva just wrote it. In all 3 countries that we visited, there is no United Nations. There is no United Nations Human Rights Committee. There is not a single person from the United Nations Refugee Committee. Only persons we saw, WHO and the International Organization of Migrations. United Nations is not existing. They have bunch of money, but no government is receiving any support from these institutions. They're just coming, talking, and donations for themselves and living. Sorry.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I would just say it's a really good point, Ravshan, is that, maybe this is something that NGIC and others can do, is to call on the UN and UNHCR to be more involved. But anyway, please go ahead, Jean. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, let me just follow up on that particular comment. I think I'm going on this next mission in a couple of weeks, looking forward to be on the ground, but we have to pull in UNICEF. We have to pull in UNHCR. We have to pull in some of these other groups, Lestrada. So before I land on the ground, I'm hoping, Ravshan, that we can at least have senior folks on the ground that we meet with on this issue. Look, there's been human trafficking in this region for a long time, but what we're seeing right now and the feedback we're getting on the ground is that children and women, there's visual evidence that they're being passed to traffickers from Italy, from gangs, from a number of countries. We are working right now on a technical solution because one of the huge problems in child protection is having some kind of way to track and trace. So we have a number of tech companies that are galvanizing an effort to put some things on the ground with now Ukraine and other organizations with regards to biometrics, at least facial recognition, We'd love fingerprints. There are all sorts of issues with all of that, and I don't have time to get into it here in terms of interoperability, data protection, privacy, et cetera. We're trying to work through those, but we've got to start with getting some digital track and tracing on the ground. I have a lot more to say on this, and I'm looking forward to being with Ravshan and the team on the ground in Poland and trying to make sure we galvanize resources. I can't support strongly enough what Eka said, is that while there is the great need for an immediate response, the network of alliances to work on what we need to do now for the future is critical. I mean, we're going to be tracking and tracing these kids for years potentially. So we need to build that infrastructure to make sure that we can get kids and women back home who are trafficked, or reduce and mitigate the risk on the ground. So Susan, I'll stop there. I know we've got short time frame, but I'm looking forward to being on the ground with the team soon.
Well, thanks, Jean. And I think to me, this is one of the areas that the NGIC can really play an important role. Perhaps we can't bring peace about, but we can make sure that the people who are displaced and who are affected by this are being treated in the best humanitarian way they can. And I want to go to Mladen to make your comment. And then we've had Jeffrey Sachs join us. And I don't know, maybe after that, Jeffrey, if you want to make a comment. But anyway, Mr. Prime Minister, please go ahead.
First of all, hello to everybody. It's very good to see you again. And I have a real full respect for the fact-finding missions, the members of that mission who visited the refugees, and what they saw. I can imagine how difficult this is. Second, I would like to say all my support to Katerina, to her husband, and to the whole Ukrainian people. When we speak about the NGIC role, I think that we have to think about the two possibilities in the current crisis. One is to help as much as we can for the refugee crisis and to deal with that issue. But there is also another one, which I really believe that we have to do what we can, maybe without success. But this is to stop this war. This war has to be stopped because it will simply mean suffering of hundreds, millions of the people. If we accept the fact that this will continue for a year, then we can try to find the saving phase solution, in a sense that we will do everything what we can, but there will be no outcome. We have to see, is it possible to make a big pressure, if it's possible, to find a way to open the talks. This idea about the negotiations about the peace in Baku, it was excellent. Maybe we can continue with that, because as long as we accept the reality like it is, I think that the biggest suffer will be for the ordinary people in Ukraine. And somehow, somewhere there, I don't want to accept the fact that this can be the war for years, because I know from Bosnian experience how that difficult is. And at the end of the day, the parties will sit in this way or another way. Better sooner than later. So hope that we can, maybe not now, maybe we can think about that, maybe we can discuss that in Athens or somewhere in Baku, but we cannot accept the fact that this will continue for a year.
Well, thank you, Mladen. And why don't I go to, because I know we're losing time, I'll go to Jeffrey, and then Petar, I'll go to you next, because I know you've been waiting. Jeffrey, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. I will follow exactly Mladen's line. I hope we can follow two tracks. One, to help where we can on the humanitarian side. And Ravshan, if you can get me the information, I can certainly get it to the UN leadership without any delay, and brainstorm on what more can be done, and would like to do that. Especially these lapses that you are noting, which are really need correction. The second is on what we can do for peace. I think we need to raise our voices and also support and believe in a negotiated end to this war. And I think that what President Zelensky has said in the last 24 hours is very important, noting the issues of neutrality, autonomy in the Donbass as a basis for serious and urgent negotiation. I did not like at all President Biden's remarks in Warsaw when he said we will steel ourselves for a long fight. This is wrong, and it's an extremely dangerous mindset, and it is an American mindset. Long, even perpetual wars on other people's land. There is, in my opinion, I apologize for both brevity and simplification, but I believe that this war can end quickly, and I do not believe in the inevitability of spreading war. I think that that there are ways to resolve this. I do believe, and have long believed for 14 years, that NATO was a massive deflection and irritant in this scene that never should have been raised in 2008. President Zelensky said yesterday that Ukraine should be neutral. We have to help Ukraine be secure and neutral. But I do think that this war can end, and I do not want to steel us for a new generation of war. That's a very bad, outmoded, and unnecessary idea, in my opinion. I think this can be negotiated quickly, actually. Anyway, I hope so. I pray so. So thanks very much, Susan.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for your remarks. And then I think I'll go to Petar and then Valdis. And I know we're coming up close to the end of our time, so if you can make your remarks as short as possible. And then also, if you're not speaking, don't forget to mute yourself. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Allow me to start with something personal. It is so nice to have again Katerina Yushchenko among us. Katerina, I know very well it is very stupid to ask how are you, but I really hope that everything with Victor and the family is okay. My best regards to all of you. I'd like to say only a few words about the reaction of the European Union towards the war in Ukraine. I think that the European Union managed to rise to the new challenge. It succeeded to achieve a common European position on Ukraine and agreement of all leaders to tougher sanctions. This is already a fact, and I believe that Mr. Putin has already suffered his first defeat. He managed to unite Europeans in this crisis. Even more, Putin succeeded in something in which 2 American presidents failed. He stopped Nord Stream 2, possibly forever. The question, what can Europe, the United States, and the international community do to stop the conflict raised by the organizers of this conference is critical because it affects human lives, and this is the most important thing now. However, I believe that we need to start thinking just now about another equally important question. How shall we reorganize our relations with Russia after the war? One aspect of this issue is not only being considered in Europe and America, but solutions are already being found. It is obvious that dependence on Russian gas and oil must be drastically reduced. Until before the war, everyone was saying the obvious, how dependent we are on Russian energy sources. Now it is high time we turn this issue around and remember that Russia is just as dependent on European markets as Europe is on Russian gas, as the export of Russian gas to China is an extremely complex operation that requires a lot of time and huge resources. To put it simply, It is not just Putin who can scare Europe by turning off the gas tap. Europe can also scare Mr. Putin by dramatically reducing the import of Russian gas. And thank God it is already thinking in that direction. One remark, Europe must think about how to stop the Russian gas and not how to stop Russian culture and arts. The ban on Russian classical performers or the study of the Russian classical writers is an extremely stupid act, which, unlike sanctions, not only doesn't punish Putin, but quite the opposite. This kind of ban gives the Russian president a very strong trump card to defend one of his propaganda theses. The West is waging a complete war against us, a real crusade, so we have no choice but to wage war against them. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think it's extremely, what you brought up is extremely important about looking for ways to decrease Europe's and all of our dependence on Russian oil and gas. I think next we have former president of Latvia, Zlatan Sovaldis. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Just focus on some details we had today. Of course, we all want at least ceasefire, and then therefore afterwards sustainable peace. About the military and diplomatic efforts, all the diplomatic efforts have failed up to today, and the only reason is that Russia has one goal: to keep the conflict going on, to keep the war going on, but the Western part or Ukrainian part wants to create a peace and to end this conflict. So the both sides are on totally, absolutely different approaches on negotiations. Therefore, what we see on the military field, we can say Ukraine has won. At the same time, we have Russian troops on Ukrainian soil. So it's nothing today we have to be happy about. So what may change, let's say, the Putin's mind? Knowing him and understanding him, I know we must, and that's not NGIC, that's the West, must create a sudden, unexpected, painful action. That's the only thing, that's the only thing that will stop it. Because otherwise, we'll get this thing back and back, And I'll tell, every time I talk to people, in the West, Putin's Russia has been in war every 6 years. It's like a cycle, every 6 years, Putin needs a war to be in a power. And now it took 8 years because, let's say, the task was more serious. Ukraine was a more serious task than let's say, South Ossetia or Crimea. So unfortunately, it's very sad to say, but we need a ceasefire by all price. And during this ceasefire, we have to provide Ukraine with offensive weapons. Because if you understand that the end point will only be when the total territory of Ukraine is liberated from Russian troops. I see, Jeffrey, your reaction. I understand you because this is your normal Western approach. But being here on the borderline, we have to understand that unfortunately, everything is going to be settled in the battlefield. Sorry, that's so. What we can do, we have to understand we can't change the Russian from inside. The Russian society is for war, and this is a paradox. If one man kills another man, everybody wants to send him to jail. If one man kills thousands of people, everybody admires him. This is a paradox of human thinking, But we have to do everything to provide the at least, information about what's really going on in Ukraine. I talked to some of my friends in Moscow, and I was really surprised that very smart people, they are very happy about what's going on. They're not going to raise their voices against the war. So we are dealing with very specific situation, which is very difficult to understand. The other point we have to do, let's don't allow destabilization in any part of the globe. Because we were already talking about the Caucasus, we are talking about the Balkans, we are talking also about the Middle East. We should not allow any destabilization because that's what Russia needs right today. I am not a Russophobe, I'm the Latvian president who has the only one of Latvian presidents who visited Russia, and we had the best ever relationship with Russia in 2010. Things have changed, and we have to open our eyes. Putin was preparing for this war since 15 years. And one more remark, I'm always remarking that he said it's easily to divide Ukraine. That means his goal is to take a part of Ukraine, not the whole Ukraine. So we have to really think in his categories. If we think in our nice democratic world of rule of order and peaceful Europe, we will not understand Putin. That's I wanted to say, because we have to focus on refugees. We are humans, we try to help people, you see it everywhere, but it's very difficult to understand what's in the minds of Russian people.
Well, Jeffrey, do you want to make a quick comment before we move on?
Well, I just want to say that if we talk about the frequency of war, the United States absolutely matches Russia in the frequency of war or exceeds it. And I make that point not just to be provocative or against my government and so forth. I make it because the US has a very high tolerance to make Ukraine into Afghanistan, into Syria, into Iraq. The US has a very high tolerance to fight to the last Ukrainian. And this is what Biden said. This is what the US thinks. It is disastrously wrong. I know my country absolutely is on a wrong track on this. And if you want to put in even more weapons right now, you'll just end up with more dead. This war will not end that way. It will end by an agreement. And I think one thing we should really appreciate is how much provocation there has been from both sides. I don't want to go into the whole litany of it, but I've watched it for 32 years. From the first statements of Baker and Genscher to Gorbachev, I was there also personally. And I know what statements were made. I know what promises were made. I know how this enlargement, which many of you feel beneficiaries of NATO, has continued step by step over the ardent opposition of Russia. But Ukraine is something particular. It is a very long border. It is at the heart of Russia. It is vital to Russia's security. And the idea of NATO in Ukraine was a direct provocation, especially following the US role in Ukraine in 2014 and the massive arming of Ukraine after by the US, billions of dollars of arms shipments. I'm just saying we're not thinking prudently, and I don't want to have a generation of war that ends up with Ukraine looking like the disasters that we have in many US-led wars. I've lived through Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen. The US is very militarized, and you should be very careful of having an ally like that, which will be very happy for the long-term fighting. And that's my concern. I want peace in Ukraine, and I think they can have it. That's the difference. I know my country. It scares me a lot.
Well, thanks, Jeffrey, for those comments. And I was going to call on Zlatko Lagumzia, and I see he's got his camera off. Zlatko, do you have a few comments to make? And then rather than go back, because we're short on time, to people who have already spoken, do you have a comment, Zlatko, about maybe what the effect on the Western Balkans?
Susan, do you hear me? Because I have a
Yes.
problem with Wi-Fi. I hear you. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I mean, for having this an agenda. I'm really impressed. I mean, it's about 20 of us are here today discussing and open very many. I just want to give you my few impressions from Moldova and reflection, a very short one. 30 years ago, I was seeing the same things in my own country. Back in '92, I was witnessing my first meetings with refugees about 50 kilometers down from Sarajevo, and I get out of the besieged city. I saw the first refugees from, they were expelled later on. Their parents were killed, brothers were killed, and I saw the very similar things in Romania and in Chisinau in Moldova. And it really struck me back, I mean, completely. And the point is that it happened 30 years ago to me and to us in here. Today, it's happening to Ukraine. Tomorrow, it can happen to everyone in Europe. That's my first message. When I came to Moldova, I mean, I saw how that small nation have a great heart, because what they are going through, it's impressive. It's impressive how ordinary people, volunteers, what they are doing. But Moldova has no institutional capacity at all to fight these things. And I think that we should join some kind of, we see what we can do in some kind of appeal to, especially to European Union. I'm not talking about the war. I'm not talking about solutions for this. I'm not talking about peace talks. I'm just talking about helping people who are right now in desperate need in a country like Moldova. And first, I think we should focus on Moldova. And I think that, Jeffrey, you can also be of great help, because their economy is actually a non-existing economy. In 20 days, they have a donors conference organized by European Union. I mean, with all due respect, I mean, these guys are very energetic, but the prime minister, foreign minister, people we met, I don't see that they have a, so to speak, I don't see that they are aware of what is going to happen, how Europeans are going to, again, go below their expectations. I mean, first thing is institutional capacity they don't have. And a country like Moldova has to be helped much more by the European Union, international community, because to the fact that 100% of gas is coming from Russia, the fact that 80% of electricity they're getting from Transnistria, which is basically speaking Russian-controlled military base in their own country, the fact that they have they're already having extraordinary projects on local level and on state level by entrepreneurs that are talking about transformation, Jeffrey, to green economy. They're having in a pipeline 600 million euros projects, Prime Minister told us. I mean, European Union can do in these things a lot, and there's no need to wait for it. They have a wine industry that is having 20% of people who are employed in their economy, and without subsidies that they can get from European Union, they're simply dead. And the Russians will have no one to conquer because there will be nothing there. The fact that 1 out of 8 kids in Moldova today is refugee, 1 out of 8. The fact that European Union number of refugees is 160 citizens per 1 refugee from Ukraine. In Moldova, it's 1/9, okay? And Moldova is not in the European Union. And my country's privilege is that we don't border with Russia, because they need to fly over 500 kilometers with their planes and with their aircraft to come to Bosnia. If that's not the case, they would be knocking on our door with Dodik, actually provoking the things that Putin would definitely need to distract from what is going on. So my suggestion is to try to figure out how we can make appeal to Europeans first Europeans, and to UN. And Russia was talking about non-existing UN over there, which is, I mean, black hole. UN is black hole in Moldova. So, I mean, we're talking about multilateralism, we're talking about restructuring the globalization. I mean, European Union, with all respect, the biggest economic player in the world, European Union as such, has no capacity, not economic capacity, not institutional capacity, but we have to show that the European Union has no moral capacity at this stage to support a country like Moldova is. I'm not talking again about misery, about what is happening to Ukraine. I'm not talking about over 3 million people from Ukraine. I'm just talking about one simple little thing, Moldova. And that's what I saw 30 years ago. That's what I don't want to see spreading over Moldova and spreading to some countries that today have no clue that it may happen to them. We are entering a situation, and this can happen to everyone in Europe. I repeat, everyone in Europe, regardless of whether you're in the European Union or NATO. I want to say this very strongly, and I think we need to act as NGIC as a moral platform of people who have individual gravitas and collective gravitas, that our voice can be heard. So I would suggest that, maybe Jeffrey, to think that we do some editorial, some call for helping Moldova economy and fight the economy and fight against poverty that is a result of refugees crisis. Those people are greatly dealing with, regardless of all odds, regardless of everything. They are really, something which I saw many times, a long time ago, and I don't want that to happen to anyone. So I'm stopping here.
Well, thanks, Zlatko, for those very important comments. And I think, we're going to have to start wrapping up, but Eka, why don't we go to you for your comment? And then Ismail, and then I would ask maybe if Ira can wrap it up so we can try to wrap up within the next 10 to 15 minutes.
I'm sorry, but
I think one of you, either you or Sean, have to turn off.
Sorry, we have the technical.
Turn off your computer and speak to Sean, maybe. There we go.
Just a
Rafshan, you've got to unmute. There you go.
Yes,
correct. Now we go.
Sorry.
Yeah, very good.
I just couldn't really help to not to have a small comment perhaps from my side, and I don't want to be confrontational, but then, if it comes across like that, I'm sorry, but I have to make that comment. I have to say that for the countries who are Russia's neighbors and then have been victims of Russia's aggression for decades, comments which try to show to us how much we don't understand what is best for us feels very patronizing. We do understand very well, but it feels like, Jeffrey, we do understand very much what are the choices that we are making. We understand very much that what is the value of freedom and independence. We do understand that Russia does not recognize our independence and freedom. And the only solution for Russia so far that is acceptable is a limited sovereignty of the countries that it sees as part of the former empire of Russia. And this is an unacceptable predicament for the people of Ukraine, for Georgia, for Azerbaijan, and for everybody that is in this neighborhood. So as long as Russia is ready to fight against our independence, unfortunately, words don't help. And when it comes to the war in Ukraine right now, any negotiating platform that can become meaningful can only be when Russia sees that there's no other choice but to negotiate for Russia. And it's a combination of suffocating effect of sanctions that Russia can have. And it's not there yet when Russia gets close to 850 million euros for gas and oil. And then not until Russia can afford military operation from tactical or strategical point of view, when Ukraine lacks weapons to fight back effectively. We are indulging ourselves with heroic images of Ukrainians fighting, but it comes at the huge expense of Ukrainian civilians. But it is Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainians themselves who hold the agency now to say, what is it that they want for themselves? Do they see that their freedom is worth sacrifices? And they say loud and clear that it is. And they appeal to us to ask to us that, is it something worthwhile for us as well? Because that's what we believed was a uniting values and principles for all of us when it comes to independence, sovereignty, and freedom. We do understand what are the sacrifices that we are making. We are ready to fight for our freedom. We don't want to compromise that at the expense of our freedom. We will have semi-solutions that will be always something semi with more to come from Russia. And when we are told that we are not smart enough to understand whether or not NATO matters, or whether or not NATO is not something that is a danger to Russia, but rather something that brings more of the security to Russia, it really feels patronizing. I'm sorry to say, but that's my feeling.
Well, thanks for your comments, Eka. And I would just say that I didn't interpret what Jeffrey said exactly as you did, but we're all on the same side here, so let's keep moving forward. Ismail, your comment, and then we'll have Vaira finish the discussion.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I do believe we are, after all dedicated to the cause of peace, dialogue, understanding, and so on. I think we have two additional things beyond the immediacy of what's going on in Ukraine. And yes, I salute all the work that's being done to bring the UN and help with the refugees and trafficking and all of these other things, which we can perhaps do a very serious and constructive thing. But beyond that, it is clear that, I mean, at least it appeared to me that we as NGIC are relatively small in terms of dealing with the mediation between Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden and others on this point. But there are at least two things which we all share beyond our past experiences. We are public intellectuals, right, Jeffrey? We are involved in thinking aloud about important questions of the day. And there are 2 points that I really think we need to look to. Number one is, why did all the discussions that we've had on the new multilateralism and what would happen really fail us? I mean, what is it that we should do if we really want a new multilateralism to emerge, whether founded at the UN or in some floating structure, I don't know what. But fundamentally, I think we have to look at that. We've talked a lot about the new multilateralism, but let's face it, what's happening in Ukraine is a disastrous failure of that. The second part was mentioned, and I think our friend, and this is something that we can do something about given our membership, and that is what's happening right now with Mr. Dodik in Serbia and Bosnia and so on. Now, is there something that we could do to preempt the situation from deteriorating to the point where conflict arises, if with the enormous extent of knowledge and contact that we have among our membership for that part of the world, we are seeing something happening, and that something is undermining. I mean, whatever you think of the Dayton Accords, well, they maintained peace for almost 20 years, and if it's going to be undermined right now by a new armament of the Serbian part of the Bosnian agreement, is there something that we would be in a position to do where negotiation, mediation, assistance, discussion may help? Now, that's a problem that is in the making, but if I see it happening in the making, it's worth looking at, and it's something that I believe we would be well equipped to try to do something about. So these are the two things that I would like to add above and beyond all the other discussions that we have had. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ismail. And I think your point about multilateralism and how multilateral organizations perhaps are not working well in this situation is point well taken. But I want to close out the discussion with President Vaira, if you would make comments and probably close out the discussion.
Muting, please, muting. Madam Chairman, I'm sorry, I will not be able to give a concluding remark, because I do feel that much as we are one happy family together with remarkably common goals, values, and aspirations, I cannot leave this meeting without expressing my opposition to our honorable members, Jeffrey Sachs, expressed opinions which I find deeply offensive to us as Eastern Europeans, to myself as a Latvian, and to a person who spent a great deal of my life working for us being accepted into NATO. NATO is not attacking Ukraine. Russia is attacking Ukraine. Ukraine was not threatening Russia and was not threatening its security. It was not about invading this territory. It was not. Neither is Latvia planning or ever was or capable of attacking Russia. Neither is Estonia ready to attack Russia or planning. We are not a danger to Russia's security. But I admire you as an intellectual, none more than I admire your supreme intelligence and the breadth of engagement that you have done in terms of the welfare of humanity. But I do have to object to this interpretation that it is the fault of the people seeking security after, in our case, 50 years of oppression and 75 years in the case of Ukraine, that they are at fault for seeking security. And when they find it under the aegis of America, and by the way, this is one thing, I know you're engaged with your particular opinions against your own government. You have a perfect right, and that is your, in fact, duty as a citizen. But you may note, Jeffrey, that your governments, no matter which party was in power, no matter which president was president, the foreign policy of America has remained the same with all its ups and downs and with great many mistakes. And I would agree with you that there were really a great many of them. But enlarging NATO, I claim, was not one of them. And why? Because it has given security to millions of people who otherwise would be submitted to the very same dangers that presently are going on in Ukraine. And your ethnocentric, Americanocentric view is that only the great powers talking to each other can solve the problems in the world. And you're doing it over the head of the others, including over the head of the Ukrainians. And I'm sorry to hear that, Jeffrey, because I truly do admire you as a person, except for this particular point. And this is a serious one.
Well, you know, Vaira, I think that is a good way to end the discussion, because I would say, I know maybe Jeffrey wants to make a comment, but, you know, this is one of the things that this forum has, is that we can express opinions, but it also, I think, what you've just outlined is this thing that I like about this forum is, you know, trying to have each side of the Atlantic and all like-minded people to think about differing points of view, because that's something that obviously is not going on in Russia now. But Jeffrey, I saw you unmuted yourself. Do you want to say something, and then we'll close out?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I apologize if I came across in any way as patronizing. It's just a difference of opinion. It is not patronizing. I respect all of you entirely, and I understand the different points of view. I'm explaining a point of view. I have also not, I would say, an ethnocentric view of this, but a long and personal view as well, and have the interests, I believe, of the people of Ukraine dear to my heart. This is not a casual thought or a casual remark. I'm married to a person who was born and grew up in Czechoslovakia. I have no illusions. This is not some naive statement I'm making. I also have been engaged on these issues myself for 32 years intensively, from trying to help get support for Gorbachev's reforms, to Yeltsin's reforms, and to many countries in the region. So this is an engagement of more than 3 decades. I'm only talking about prudence here. I'm talking about trying to find a practical way out. Vera, you might say that Canada has its right to align with China if it wants to, or Mexico to align with China. I would just advise them prudently. I wouldn't do it. And I wouldn't do it next to the United States. I actually heard from a minister in the Caribbean last week about the US landing on them because China wanted to finance a hospital in their country. A hospital. Because what is China doing in the Caribbean? Financing a hospital. This is not that I favor great powers. I have spent my whole life with the United Nations. I favor the UN Charter. I've spent my entire life defending the UN Charter. I am trying to just say a word about prudence. It is not prudent for a US military alliance and a Russian military alliance to be on an 1,100-mile border with each other. It isn't prudent. And the result right now is mass bloodshed and killing. This is not blaming the United States or NATO. Please, it's not, it's about what we can do to stop. I believe, for example, just to add one point to our discussion, I am in favor of the sanctions. Absolutely. I'm in favor of the sanctions as part of a process of finding a negotiated peace. So I want to be clear about that. But I am in favor of there being an off-ramp of peace that we also are propounding. And I believe, and I have reason to believe, that China, which is a big part of this story of whether this war goes on or not, does not support NATO enlargement there because the United States has been aggressively turning NATO to the China mission. Thanks to Mr. Stoltenberg's statements and so forth, they're very much aware of that. And similarly, trying to create alliances in the Western Pacific region. We need China to help to have Putin stop. That's a very practical thing that could make a big difference early on. There are better ways to do that, and there are ways that make it impossible to do that. My own view is that Ukraine's neutrality would be a very good way to help have China say to Putin, it's necessary for you to stop this. So I don't want to be patronizing. I do want to disagree, but in a completely respectful way. I have my own points of view. I have watched the behavior of my government. I've watched the UN system. I have watched close up Gorbachev and Yeltsin. I know many of the actors. I have my own sense. And I also don't want to be misunderstood. And I have been to Ukraine many times to advise the government as well, from Mr. Kuchma and President Yushchenko and others. And I admire the people and have tried everything to help for 30 years personally. So this is not some glib statement. I don't want this to be a killing field or turn into World War III. And it can do both. And when Biden said what he said a couple of days ago, just know that wasn't a gaffe. That was a mindset. And it's a mindset that can get everybody killed. Because the mindset of the United States is we determine who runs which countries. It's not a good mindset. We said Assad must go. Obama and Clinton said that in 2011. Assad is very much with us, but his country was destroyed. And by the way, Russia entered in 2014. The United States entered through the CIA backdoor in 2011. And then in Operation Sycamore in 2012 and 2013, Russia came later. We were there. The CIA was there in Afghanistan before Russia invaded, as you know. That was even a trap set by the US CIA, supposedly. 40 years of killing in Afghanistan. I'm just suggesting some prudence. And by the way, not to sacrifice Ukraine's freedom or sovereignty. I just don't believe it's a good idea to have a US military alliance in Ukraine and to believe that as much as you want it and as much as it seems highly desirable, that this is a way for the planet to survive right now. I also wrote a book about and have studied extensively the 3 years preceding the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I just would warn you, you know it, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be patronizing, just to remind you how this can spin completely out of control. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis almost went one torpedo away, vetoed by a Soviet Communist Party official on the submarine saying, no, don't fire, was probably one torpedo away from World War III. So that's my view. I know people disagree, and I know that we're in the heat of the most intense episode of our lives, or among them. And so I apologize for imperfect knowledge conveyance. It's not meant to be patronizing. It's meant to explain a point of view that I really feel deeply. I could be completely wrong, but I'm worried to the core that this will spiral into a nuclear war, and that it will at least continue as a ongoing brutal conflict until there is a smarter way out. And I believe that there is a smarter way out that I've expressed, that you don't like, but any way that I've expressed.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for clarifying that point of view. And I think, again, this is why we're all meeting, so that we can share our points of view and our thoughts. And I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. So, Ravshan, I don't know if you have any final things that you want to say, but we've been taking notes, and we'll try to come up with some ideas and recommendations from today's discussion. Anything from you, Ravshan?
No, thank you so much, and thanks everyone. As President Zattler said, very good thing, that the only way that what we have to do is just to continue doing what we are doing, because we have to talk, we have to discuss, because we shouldn't forget about this. It happened in Georgia, it happened in Azerbaijan, it's again happening in somewhere else, and just because I sent all of you the paper which Tsipelivny wrote, and it was really amazing paper about how multilateralism is dead. And as I liked when President Vaida said that she doesn't want to hear multilateralism because it's really dead. When Secretary General of UN is creating a group of high-level eminent personalities, which not a single person knows about them. And they are, instead of building multilateralism, they are killing it up and down. But let's try to do our best. And any ways that you can just share information or tweet, your social media, every way that it's really helpful, because we have to keep on doing what we are doing.
Well, thanks, Ravshan. And I also want to thank Katerina, especially to you, because you're there, and we really admire the bravery and the strength of the Ukrainian people. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.